And we are ready for the last section, and this is a long section, but the last section of the unit on the Civil War. And realize all the stuff we're going through here, there's so much time that could be spent on all of this, and there's so many things that we're leaving out and we're skipping. That just this is what we have time for and time to do, so that's why we're hitting. But realize there's so much more that could be told as far as the story and the way this goes. But it's now 1864, and President Lincoln names Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, the commander and chief of the Union Army. And Grant's philosophy was very simple. It was his quote, "The art of war is simple. Find out where your enemy is, get at them as soon as you can, and strike them as hard as you can, and keep on moving or keep moving on." So basically, hit them, knock them down, and go. Get through them, and don't mess around. After some of the leadership we had, especially at the beginning under McClellan, Lincoln loved this. Lincoln was like, "Yeah, this is what we want. He's our man," and he's been kind of leading the Western battles anyway. Speaking of the Western battles, in July of 1863, everything really started to turn in the favor of the Union. They were trying to take the city of Vicksburg, and it was set up on a cliff that overlooked the Mississippi River. Well, every time under leadership of Grant that they would try to take it, they would be spotted going up the river, and they would be shot at. So this wasn't working. So Grant decided to have the troops go inland. And what they did is they went, instead of just going up the river, they went marched into the state, and went and took Jackson, Mississippi, and then came back from behind and attacked Vicksburg. And it's kind of hard to show you without a map, and I don't have a map on this right now. But they kind of snuck around and attacked Vicksburg from behind. And this gave them total control over the Mississippi River. And what it did is it cut the Confederacy into two parts. Arkansas and Louisiana were on the western part of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy couldn't get to them, and they couldn't get to the rest of the Confederacy. So they were basically split off, and they were their own whatever. I don't even know if you call them a country. They were just there, and they couldn't get to anywhere else. They were kind of quarantined, I guess. It would be a word that we're using more often now. They were just stuck. They couldn't go either direction. To the east, they had a lot of battles. The main one was the Battle of Gettysburg, and the South had momentum. They were winning a lot of battles and being very successful to the east, a lot more than they were to the west. Well, General Lee, remember the Southern leader, General Robert E. Lee, moved into Pennsylvania, hoping to surprise the Union and eventually capture Washington, D.C. Well, the two armies met up in eastern Pennsylvania, in a small town called Gettysburg, and they had probably the most famous battle of the whole war. On the first day of fighting, there were 3 days of fighting. On the first day, the Confederates were successful. They drove the Union out. They would not let the Union through. They pushed them back. They were the ones that were trying to storm through. So they were getting through. They were doing what they wanted to do. The Union regrouped, and on the second day, they were more successful. They kind of pushed back a little bit and kind of evened things out. And this led us to the third and what would be the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And what happened is there were a lot of casualties the first 2 days, especially on the South. But on the third day, Lee ordered General Pickett to lead 15,000 men and charge towards the Union. Like, we're just going all in. We are charging the Union. We're going after them, and we're gonna go. Well, the big problem with this is they had to march through an open field to get to where the Union was. And this open field was about 1,000 yards long and came up on a steep slope where the Union could sit and see them and fire at them and shoot them one after another. And this was known as Pickett's Charge. And they were, this was just devastating for the South. They just got so many people killed because of this. And Pickett was named after George Pickett, who was the guy who was leading them at the time on the charge. But just row after row of Confederate troops were shot and killed, and the Union went on to win this victory at Gettysburg. And with that, and at the same time, the Battle of Vicksburg going on in the West that I explained to you earlier, it marked the turning point of the war. This was when the North really, really took control. It went from being close back and forth to not close. The Gettysburg Address, after the Battle of Gettysburg, they had more than 50,000 people that were killed or wounded there, and they had built a cemetery. And this is like 5 months later, and they had President Lincoln come and dedicate the cemetery to all those that had lost their lives. And he gave us a speech. It was a very short speech, but he gave a speech, and it was known as the Gettysburg Address. And it's probably the most famous speech any president's ever given. And it starts with 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Well, 7 years ago. 7 years. How many years is that? Well, a score is 20 years. So 4 to be 4 times 20, so it's 80. And 7 is 87. So 87 years ago, which 87 years prior to this was 1776. So he's saying, 87 years ago, we developed a new country, and now here we are fighting to make the country whole, make it better, get it back to the way that we originally planned on having it. Well, the success for the North had them go to a strategy known as total war. And it was Grant's plan on ending the war and finishing this up. He just wanted to destroy everything, destroy the South's ability to fight, the South's ability to do anything. So what they started doing was destroying everything in their path. Now, we watch The Patriot. This kind of reminds me of the way Tavington was in The Patriot. And that's not to say Grant was a jerk like Tavington, but it was basically do whatever it takes to get this war over with. So that's what they did. They would go through and they would win, and they would just destroy everything that they saw. They would destroy food, equipment, livestock, houses, anything that could be useful for the South, they destroyed. Unfortunately, they even went after some civilians, killed some civilians, and it just wasn't Grant. It was all of the North started doing this. They wanted to get this war over. A famous general was Philip Sheridan, and he was successful at the Battle of Shenandoah. William Tecumseh Sherman, he captured Atlanta and began what was called the March to the Sea. And this is a very famous thing from the Civil War, where they basically marched from Atlanta all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, just destroying everything that came in their path. Because it was all Southern territory, so anything and everything that they saw, they destroyed. So we were just totally taking everything that we could. Well, it's 1864, and it's getting the last part of 1864, so it's time for a presidential election. Well, President Lincoln, once again, was going to run, and he had, he's thought of as a great president, but for the first 3.5 years, he was not thought of as a great president. People did not like Lincoln, Northerners or Southerners. They weren't winning the war. This war was supposed to last 3 months, and here we are 3 years into it, and we've not won, and we were losing the war for a long time. So Lincoln wasn't that popular. And until things started to change. And in 1864, when we started to really dominate, as opposed to the way things had been going before that. So a lot of people didn't agree with his stance on slavery, and he just wasn't very popular. But the person that ran against him was our old friend George McClellan, the guy that didn't share a whole lot, that was not aggressive at all, that got fired by Lincoln. And complete contrast from what we had now with Grant, who was just going through and bulldozing everything in his path. Well, McClellan, his strategy to win the presidency was he was willing to sit down with the South and talk and compromise and get them back. Maybe make some kind of compromise, which probably would have meant leaving slavery, keeping slavery, and making all this war kind of a whole useless thing. Well, in the end, Lincoln won, and he won because of all the success the North had in 1864. Had it not been for that, then there's no way that I think Lincoln would have been reelected as president. But we had starting in 1863 and then into 1864, we had taken over the war on both fronts, and we're starting to be much more successful than we had been earlier. So, because of this, Lincoln was able to win the presidency. It's time to end the war. In 1864, May of 1864, Grant went after Richmond. And again, that's the Confederate capital. There were many lives lost as they marched towards there. A lot of Northern lives, a lot of Southern lives. The North had more men and supplies than the South had. So a lot of people dying impacted the South more. If there's 100 on my team and 50 on your team, and we each lose 25, well, I still have 75. Now you're down to 25. You lost half yours. I just lost a quarter of mine. So that's kind of how that went. And the numbers weren't like that, but that's just what it means that this hurt the South more. The South was under siege for 9 months. Under siege. And what that means is they were pretty much stuck. They were trapped. They couldn't get out one way or another. If they tried to get out, then they would get shot, or they were just trapped. They couldn't go anywhere. They couldn't do anything. But they just stayed under siege. They wouldn't give up. They wouldn't surrender. But finally, on April 2nd, the North finished off the job. The South did finally give up at Richmond. And then a week later, on April the 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in the Richmond area, I believe, and that ended the war. So now, when the war is over, we do our little, our treaty, our agreement, or whatever, to see who makes out the best. And the North was very generous to the South in the peace agreement. They allowed them to keep their animals and to go home with little or no punishment. Most of the time, no punishment. Just go home, and you've lost, but you're still part. You're back to the United States. There's no more Confederate States of America, so we're not going to punish you as much. They were just once again part of the same country, so they weren't going to punish their countrymen like they would other country, because their punishment is they lost their new country that they were going to have. So it'd be like if we lost the Revolutionary War, England probably wouldn't have punished as much, just we'd be back to being part of England. And there was some punishment and that kind of thing, but it wasn't like it was in the other wars that we had discussed earlier in the school year. So the Civil War, it is the biggest event in United States history. Total, more than 360,000 Union soldiers and more than 250,000 Confederate soldiers were killed. That's more than 500,000 people were killed. The total cost of the war was over $20 billion, and this is 1860s money, $20 billion. This is more than what the country had spent in its existence. So in the first 85 to 90 years, we had spent less than $20 billion as a country. In 4 years, we spent $20 billion fighting this war against ourselves. The war put an end to slavery. It was over. All across the United States, African Americans were now free, including the border states everywhere. It's now everywhere. And lastly, Americans stopped referring to themselves as these United States of America, but now call themselves the United States of America. Then I ask, what's the difference? Now, I'm not going to give you the answer, but there is a difference in saying these United States of America versus the United States of America. And you're going to have to tell me what the difference is between the two. So that ends our story of how we went from being a country after winning the Revolutionary War. We wrote a constitution. We had a destiny to get all the land that we could. We added many, 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 many more states. We started to disagree with each other. We broke into political parties. We had the South, many of the southern states, leave the United States. But now we are back together, and we are now once again the United States of America. It's 1865. Our country is not even quite 90 years old, and we've been through all this already. We'll pick up and do a little bit more with the story this year, and then next year you will take the story and go from there and learn more what happens in the 1900s and that kind of thing. So that's all from the notes, and I hope you have a better understanding of the Civil War.